hearing impairment. I was diagnosed with hearing impairment a few years ago. Living with Meniere's disease, a condition with genetic links, gave me a personal window into how deeply hearing loss affects quality of life, not just physically, but emotionally too. It made me realize how essential awareness and accessibility are, not just for those living with it now, but for future generations. In Frontiers in Rehabilitation Sciences, authors Sarah E. Warren and Autumn L. Barron note that audiologists are aware of their role in assessing a patient's emotional needs, yet their scope is limited. Most existing data focuses on adults and older people, which highlights the urgent need to study hearing loss and depression in youth. Similarly, neurologists Lin Zhang, Huang Du, and Huan Yu stress the importance of psychiatric care for hearing loss patients. So, my research asks, how can we develop and apply preventative strategies to identify depression in adolescents with hearing loss? To answer this, I conducted a series of interviews with both hearing-impaired youth and audiologists. After explaining the purpose and scope of my research, I began reaching out to families with children affected by hearing loss, inviting them to participate in the interview. I connected with a social worker who specializes in working with deaf families. I also reached out through social media, where many parents and young people actively use their platforms to educate others about hearing loss. Additionally, I shared my contact information with local audiologists and asked them to pass it along to any interested families. I also contacted an organization dedicated to supporting deaf children and requested their help spreading the word about my study. This propulsive sampling approach was designed to help me connect with more families willing to share their experiences. While I'm not a professionally trained interviewer, all participants were informed that they could withdraw from the study at any time. I chose interviews over surveys so conversations could be more fluid and tailored to each individual. This format allowed for deeper, more personal connections and an exploration of each story. My research followed a mixed method, non-experimental approach to explore how we might develop preventative strategies to screen for depression in adolescents with hearing loss. The nature of this project was simply listening. I sat down with young people and heard, in their own words, how their hearing loss intersected with their mental and emotional well-being. Over 3 months, I conducted 5 in-depth interviews with youth and young adults with hearing loss. Following a similar model to Van Eedelijk's Dutch hearing loss study, I did not limit my participant pool based on the origin or severity of their hearing loss. Some participants were born deaf, others lost their hearing gradually, or due to environmental factors. Whether fully deaf or hard of hearing, each voice added a valuable nuance to the data. However, this variation is something to be considered in my final analysis. Interview questions were developed around the key themes I wanted to explore, primarily the lived experiences of hearing loss and its emotional and psychological impacts. All interviewers were conducted via social media platforms to ensure accessibility and convenience for both me and the participants. Initially, I planned to include a standardized mental health screener, such as a patient health questionnaire form, also known as a PHQ form. However, after my early interviews, I realized that introducing a formal survey might overwhelm or emotionally burden participants. Out of care and respect for their comfort, I chose not to include this component, though I acknowledge this decision as a limitation regarding the data depth and standardization. To ensure privacy, all participants and children and their parents were assigned anonymizing ID codes, and no identifying information was recorded. Ultimately, my goal was to uncover not just data, but the emotional realities behind the scientific gap and the lack of social awareness surrounding youth hearing loss and mental health. To balance the youth perspectives, I also contacted 24 audiologists through the American Audiology Directory. 4 agreed to participate. I conducted these interviews over 3 months again. These conversations offered a clinical viewpoint into how the challenges mental health professionals face when addressing emotional well-being in their patients. The relative theme of questions asked to participants stayed the same. However, some questions were altered depending on age. While a more significant number of questions were asked to audiologists, both questions for audiologists and youth were meant to have correlating meanings. For example, if an audiologist was asked, how often do audiologists work with mental health professionals when addressing youth hearing loss? Is this collaboration common or rare? Then a deaf or hard of hearing person was asked, have you had access to mental health support that understands the unique challenges of being deaf or hard of hearing? A common thread in youth interviews was a lack of awareness, not just from themselves, but from those around them, about the connection between hearing loss and depression. Initially, I assumed that individuals would be more aware of their hearing health. However, I quickly discovered that many participants did not recognize the signs of hearing loss until it had already begun to interfere with their communication significantly. These insights were particularly striking to me, as my own experience with rapid onset hearing loss made the challenge immediately noticeable. I hadn't considered that for many, hearing loss can develop gradually and go largely unnoticed for extended periods. In addition, some had doctors who misjudged the extent of their impairment. One participant shared, quote, "Most of them, medical professionals, didn't even understand my level of hearing loss and my ability to do things. They had their assumptions. Some of them thought I wasn't fully deaf because I could hear well with my cochlear implants," end quote. None of the youth also knew that they were at a higher risk for depression due to their hearing loss. More alarmingly, some adults reflected on childhoods where their undiagnosed hearing loss led to being mislabeled as bad kids or poor learners. Participants explained how they had little interest in school because learning was hard. They didn't realize their struggles stemmed from a hearing impairment. One participant nearly dropped out of high school before discovering they had severe bilateral hearing loss. What struck me the most, and what was perhaps hardest to hear, was how often children with hearing loss were punished not for misbehavior, but for simply being misunderstood. Without the proper accommodations or awareness, many were seen as defiant when they didn't respond, or labeled as inattentive when they couldn't follow instructions. Teachers often couldn't distinguish between a child unwilling to listen and one who physically couldn't, even if teachers were made aware that the student had a disability. And so, instead of receiving support, these students were met with detentions, suspensions, and shame. Again and again, the stories I heard echoed the same quiet heartbreak: children disciplined for something entirely out of their control. What was described to me in these interviews wasn't just neglect, it bordered on emotional abuse, being singled out, blamed, and isolated for having an invisible disability. While some might assume that times have changed and that schools today are more inclusive and understanding, but unfortunately, many of these patterns still persist. My youngest participant, age 11, explained how their parents had to move to a more inclusive state after their local school failed to support them. These stories mirror the findings of Dr. Susanna Kosh and Dr. Kathleen Helmer, who note similar exclusion and lack of resources for older people in nursing homes, a reminder that marginalization spans age groups. All the audiologists acknowledged a lack of formal education connecting hearing loss to mental health. One said that they only learned of the link in recent years. Another audiologist said that while public early childhood education programs try to fill the gap that audiologists can't, that their support is described as spotty as best. Barriers to better support include limited appointment times, fear of overstepping professional boundaries, and pressure from low-cost competitors like Costco. One audiologist mentioned that they avoid discussing mental health benefits of hearing aids specifically to prevent sounding like they're trying to sell a product to patients. These findings suggest that a major roadblock is the lack of awareness in schools, clinics, and the hearing loss community itself. Without this awareness, early intervention is nearly impossible. While the insights were meaningful, my study had its limits. I interviewed only 5 youth and 4 audiologists, most of whom were from Vermont or found via social media. The subjective nature of my interviews and my experience with hearing loss may have influenced my interpretation. Also, while I initially planned on using a PHQ form, I chose not to for emotional safety, which also limited the data's clinical depth. Despite these limitations, the findings strongly suggest that earlier intervention and better integration of mental health education into audiology practices could be game-changing. As seen in neurologist Victor Jones' nursing home research, future studies could use surveys to reach a wider audience and gather quantifiable data. In audiology clinics, short mental health screeners could be implemented before appointments and integrated into continuing education requirements for audiologists themselves. This would equip practitioners with the tools to identify depression earlier and refer patients to the appropriate care, relieving the pressure on under-resourced school systems. Overall, hearing loss and its connection to mental health is critical but often overlooked. Youth with hearing loss face a compounded struggle that includes misunderstandings, misdiagnosis, and missed opportunities for support. The 4 most significant obstacles to proactive care are lack of awareness, inadequate school support, an underdeveloped mental health framework, and limits to audiologists can or are willing to offer. There is no single fix, but progress starts with informed advocacy, accessibility, and choice. Each child's journey with hearing loss is unique, and they deserve the tools and support to navigate it in their own terms. By promoting awareness and early intervention, we can help reduce depression rates in hearing loss youth and create a more inclusive, understanding world for them to grow up in. Thank you, and my sources are available upon request. Questions?
What type of, I guess, classes do you think would best benefit these students that are experiencing hearing loss at school be taught? Because I know for like dyslexia, they teach ESL classes to help with your phonics and stuff. Do you think there's a class that could benefit those students?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think really the big thing is maybe not a specific class, but better accommodations in classes. So things like making sure every video has closed captions, for example, and making sure that like the needs of hearing loss students are met. Teachers are facing students when they're talking to them and things like that. I think that the exclusion of kids with hearing impairment in schools is a problem, and that they need to learn with everyone else, but they do need to have their own accommodations.
How does our school help with students with hearing loss?
So every school is different. St. Johnsbury Academy has kind of like a learning center for students with disabilities, but every kind of need is based on the individual. For me personally, I have a 504 plan, which like helps advocate that I need teachers to like look at me directly, and I need closed captioning on videos and things like that. But again, like every school is different, and some schools don't really have a great program. So it's really on like the parents themselves or the students themselves to advocate for them.
How do you think like St. Johnsbury Academy could improve their resources for students with hearing impairment?
I think here at the Academy, what's tough is there isn't a lot of kids with hearing impairment, and there hasn't been. So I think St. J just doesn't really know what these types of kids need. I think just hearing students out more would be beneficial. The social worker I worked with on this project, they actually go into schools and they kind of do a simulation with teachers about what it's like to be deaf. They give teachers earplugs and then ask them to do like a simple spelling test to like put students in their shoes to see what it's like going through like classes and not being able to hear. So I think things like that are helpful to educate teachers, but I overall just think that there needs to be more accessibility in education.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. In your research, did you find any significant differences with children that were born deaf versus children that have onset hearing loss?
Yeah, great question. Well, my participant pool is limited. I did find that it kind of just varied per kid, because I interviewed one kid who was born deaf, but the rest of his family were hearing. So there was some isolation in that aspect. I think the story just kind of changes for every kid. I think with onset hearing loss, there is a greater struggle just because it wasn't always like that. But I think just having the tools to help support those kids no matter what.
When you first knew that you had a problem with your hearing, were you ever dismissed by like family or friends or doctors?
I was never dismissed by my family. I have a really supportive family. And me and my mother actually got our hearing aids at the same time, which was a little interesting. But I think for me personally, I've had a hard time with doctors understanding kind of the scope of my hearing loss. With it being early onset, that definitely was difficult. But I just think that pretty much everyone that I've talked to about my hearing loss, they're just willing to learn and they just want to know more. So I really haven't been met with many challenges, thankfully, and people have been pretty understanding.
I'm on the Vermont State Youth Council. We advocate for needs like this in education. Is there anything that you would like us to do about this, or any legislation that would help, or recommendations?
In terms of legislation, I just think right now we're at a really critical point where there is certain supports for children with all disabilities that are shutting down and maybe not being provided as much. So I just think it's making sure that we're still advocating for these kids in schools, despite maybe a lack of legislation, but I think there can just always be more support for these kids. And I think navigating childhood with hearing loss is just incredibly difficult, and the fact that these kids don't have enough mental health support, I think, is really challenging too. So I just think overall there can be improvement.
So I have two questions for you, Taryn. One, can you share with us the number of subjects that you interviewed from each category? So like young people who have hearing loss versus the professionals. How many subjects were in your study?
Yeah, so I had 5 hearing impaired individuals, and then I had 4 audiologists that I worked with.
Okay, thanks. Question 2, I think you mentioned early in the presentation a connection, what you're trying to investigate between depression and hearing loss. I wonder, did you use a particular psychological inventory to measure depression, say, with those subjects, or what did you do there?
Mainly, I wanted to do that at first with the PHQ form that I talked about earlier in my presentation, but I just decided that was going to be out of the scope of my research. It wasn't necessarily finding people with hearing loss that also had depression. It was mainly interviewing people with hearing loss and asking about their overall experience with mental health, just because even if they didn't necessarily felt that they themselves had depression, they did understand that they hadn't had any sort of education on the fact that they did have that doubled risk and that there wasn't really any proactive care for mental health.
I have a question. Do you think that mental health supports would have to be adapted for students who have hearing loss?
Yeah, I think it kind of just looks, again, like different for every student. Me with my hearing aids, I can get by pretty well. I think overall for mental health support in general, I mean, for some people that might look like having an interpreter in a mental health appointment or things like that. But yeah, I think, again, needs vary, and I think just as hearing loss is a spectrum itself, the needs are a spectrum too.